Welcome to Maintaining the G7 Print Condition. Today we're going to talk about how to use measurement and process control to maintain your G7 print condition. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about how to maintain a G7 print condition. We've just been introduced by Ellis and Wachob. My name is Ron Ellis, and I'll be one of your speakers today. And we also have Jim Wachob from the HardingPoorman group. Jim will be, he's a real-life user, and he's going to give real hands-on experience. We'll move right now and talk about our agenda. Today, what we're going to cover first is how to maintain a G7 print condition. We're going to go through actual real-life measurements. I'm going to pull out a press sheet, I'll measure it, and you'll see how we analyze and look at a press sheet and see if it's matching the G7 print condition. After example measurements, we're going to have Jim from HardingPoorman group speak. And Jim, as I said, is a great user because he uses this every day, and he's going to talk about how they run up to a make-ready, how they troubleshoot a job when it's not matching. They're a perfect example of somebody using process control correctly, and they use it. After that, there's an opportunity for a question and answer. Before we start, we're going to talk a little bit about manufacturing. I want to talk about relates to printing today and the way that printing works. The recession is very difficult for printers, and in the Boston area where TeshCon is based and also where I'm based as a consultant, in alone we lost over 100 printers during the 2 years of the recession. And less than 10% of these printers had scanners on the press or 7 printers. So talking about it is important because it relates to how efficient people are. As we went through the list of who went out of business, we would basically look at, did they have scanners, were they G7, how modern was their equipment, and they were not efficient. So the one good thing that did come out of the recession is that the printers are still around here are much leaner and much more efficient than ever. And I've seen this firsthand. Recently I was traveling through Asia, and printers are running like we did 10 years ago. They don't have on most of the presses, much more waste. And the different economy, it's a little different, so they can afford to waste more. They use hand scanning on their Epson proofs, so there's an I1 by hand, whereas pretty much every printer in the US that buys a new Epson now is in the auto scanner so that every single proof is QC'd and checked. So it's different. And it's one great thing about US printing right now is the printers who remain are very, very efficient. For successful printers right now, everything is automated. And the most printers realize that with tight margins, the only way to become more profitable is to be more efficient. So to reduce our manufacturing costs, and one way to do that is to reduce the time it takes us to get to color. And the second to that is to remain repeatable so that we don't get back into being inefficient. Print a controlled process, and that means that printing is manufacturing. So we're getting away from craft and moving it towards manufacturing, which means we have to know what we're doing all the time and be very, very good at it. One thing about G7 is the target. So the G7 print condition is the target used by most of the printers in the US, as well as most of the printers in Asia and Latin America. G7's been a great thing for US print because it has suddenly given printers targets to aim at. And before G7, most printers used their presses as a target. It means that they take a press in the press room, they'd run a sheet, they'd record patches off it, they'd match the proofer to that press. The problem because the press is the least stable part of the print workflow. It's a situation in which we look at the press and the press just, it's unable to hold. It's mechanical, it's varying, it's moving all the time. Even brand presses, day after day, are changing. So with having a target, it's impossible to tell how good you're doing. And so many printers in this scenario had a target. They actually could not tell day to day where they were. And if you don't, you just don't know how you're printing, and you have to have something to measure. And if you're measuring, you have to have something to compare those measurements to. basically, if you don't know how you're printing, if you don't know what color your ink is, what your dot gain is, what color the print is, you're printing to chaos. So betting about G7, it gave a universal target. We can hit it with proofers, we can hit it with digital printers, we can hit it with offset presses. And we can tell if we're hitting it. We have something to measure against. So one thing happens, and one thing that we found as people began doing G7 calibrations is that it's really easy to do that calibration. It's nice calibration, it's fast, it's quick. Like I said, it's a target, you can tell if you've achieved it. This topic of G7 calibration, the thing that the G7 calibration part of it is a procedure. It's to line up the press to the G7 aims that we're going for. Calibration is a one-time procedure because the press is constantly changing. And press will drift away from it. It's just a matter of time. So people doing G7 calibrate the press to it, they nail in the sheet to get qualified, and then they don't watch that calibration. And the press being the most variable part of the press, if you think about it, we have blankets, rollers, chemistry, all those change every day. So drift is inevitable. The only way to keep a repeatable print condition is to measure and then correct when we deviate. So G7 is a great calibration method. It's also an aim. To only calibrate and to not constantly monitor how you're doing against that aim is to kind of some of the big value that G7 brings to us. Next thing, as I mentioned, it's important to measure, and that goes to the importance of the measurement. Measuring, how do you know if you're out of calibration? Kind of the key thing. If you're not measuring, you have no knowing if you're actually achieving your target. So measure tell us if the conditions have changed, and by measuring, we can predict if we'll be able to match a proof. Measure on press, the things that you're going to see us measuring in the next few screens. If measuring on press and unable to achieve those, if we're not hitting those numbers the way we should, we're not going to be able to match a proof. And if we can't prove, we're not going to make our make ready, and then we're throwing money away. So this measurement, we can tell if the press is still profitable. We need quick to be efficient and to stay in business. We don't disasters where suddenly we can't match a proof and the customer comes in and they're not happy and we look like idiots. Something about this business today pertains to getting up to color quickly and printing, and that's where the money is. I'll say this quote again, but as Peter Drucker said, what gets managed. So measuring, you're not doing yourself any favors. That's how we tell if we're meeting our targets. It's how we tell our make readies are going to be achievable. It's how if we're doing good printing. G7, it's great to have a target, but the metrics for G7, the way that we do things with G7 are completely different than traditional press metrics. So key G7 metrics that we look at are based on LAB color, G7 based on color, and it's based on the color of the gray rather than the traditional print attributes that we're used to, like density and dot gain. It's certain. And if you, one thing I tell my customers is that if you'd like to be in this industry in 5 years from now, if you'd like to be in there 10 years from now when I'm working with people, make sure you learn LAB color. Because the people who understand how to measure and QC LAB color are going to be the people who are employed. And the growth in the U.S. print industry, which are things like packaging and traditional printing, in these markets is based on this. So when I deal with major brands, with major customers, they're using and accepting jobs in many cases based on LAB comparison of LAB colors. So if there's one thing worth learning, it's how to understand lab color. I don't expect every press operator to learn this. Some do, but the ones who don't will translate it into their local process control aims, which mean density and dot gain. But there's got someone in that plant when a job isn't hitting make ready who understands LAB to be able to troubleshoot it. You're going to get it in the next few screens. So as I go through and I look at this press sheet, you're going to see how we use LAB and how we use tools that can interpret LAB like the SpectroDens to where we are and what's going on. In G7, there are two compliance levels that are really common and really important. The There's actually 4, but we're only going to talk about 2 of them here. So before we go any further, we're going to cover this and make sure you understand it. There's 2 G7 calibrations that are very common on press. The first one is called G7 gray. G7 gray is only a calibration to gray, balance, and tonality. So this means G7 gray, we primarily care about gray. And the weighted tone curve for the CMY is correct, and the balance being correct. Those are the 2 components. We want to make sure it's gray. We want to make sure that the curve is the right weight up and down it. The second one is G7 targeted. G7 is also concerned with gray and tonality, but it's also concerned with the color space. And gray, we're going to be looking at many more things. That means part of the solids to be a certain color, the overprints to be a certain color, to target aims, and gives us a much more accurate color match, especially in the hard colors. If I walk into a printing plant and people tell me they're having trouble matching the purple on the proof, maybe the bright reds, the maroons, the sky, that's overprint. And if those colors, those overprints aren't correct, then I know they're not going to match the proof. So we're looking at more when we're doing targeted. And pretty much if you're an offset printer matching GRACOL, you're G7 targeted. So G7 gray tends to be things like flexo, screen print, things where they can't achieve the color space. So it's going to give them a perfect match in the midtones. It's going to be neutral. It's going to be gray. You could even hold it up against a GRACOL proof, and pretty much except for those overprints and a few other areas, it's going to look like a match. But when you're being precise, which would be offset, we're going to do G7 targeted, and that's how we're going to match it. These G7 metrics that we're going to talk about, the first one, and you can see it on the screen here, is NPDC. That's in the upper right-hand corner. And you can see there's a CMY curve, and there's a NPDC black curve as well. These are the weight, so these are the tone weight. Now the CMY is combined, so all 3 of those together, we measure the gray, and it should be that tone value. That's called the L, and also corresponds to the L star of LAB. The second thing we have is gray, and gray is delta F, or delta CH. And if gray, which is the bottom graphic, we want to make sure that we're neutral, that we're not casting off in one direction. And that's the AB of LAB that we're using to look at that. So they're very, very important, and measure them. And this is G7 gray. We're gray, we have the right weight. Pretty much any CMYK device we can use this with. It could be a digital printer, could be flow, could be gravure, could be screen printing, could be wide format, could be offset. It's for anything that's CMYK. So for this, these are the fundamentals that we look for. And one important thing to note, you notice that on that little click in the middle, it says max density. And G7 scales to the paper color and the ink color, the maximum neutral density. So as we change our print method, as we change our substrate, G7 actually takes that into account and moves with it and scales it. G7 targeted, we have other metrics, and these metrics become important as I talked about. And that's the color of the ink, and that's the color of the overprints. And pretty, because as I mentioned, this is assuring that our ink is the right color and that our prints are the right color. And as we do process control, this helps us to see if an ink has changed, or has changed. So very, very important. Now, if you look here, we have the things that we're checking on a sheet-fed press usually. We look at it, we're going to check targeted stuff, NDC, we're going to check delta F. And then look over in the right, you can see CMYK. Over the right of that, past density. And density is not color, it's ink film thickness. But past density, you can see delta E. So we have target values, which for GRACOL are based on ISO. And this is basically what color the ink should be, what color the overprint should be. And it goes that delta E, which is a deviation between 2 numbers, telling us how far apart it is. Now I want to be less than 5 for my solids, and for me, I like to be less than 5 for my overprints. And GRACOL does have requirements. We want to have, if you're GRACOL G7 targeted to GRACOL, we want you to have your solids and your overprints within a certain set of numbers. So looking at this, these are important. When we line up a press, and then when we go out and actually see what's wrong with the job, these are some of the things we're going to look at. So this example, if I was reading the gray patch, which is a 50-40-40 patch in GRACOL, what I should be seeing is the E being 57, the 8 arrow, and the B being -1. That changes depending on paper color, but if I'm looking at the GRACOL data set, that's exactly where it should be. I want my solids to be 5 delta E or less against those lab values that are below, and my overprints to be 5 delta E or less against the lab values that are below. So just a quick example. It gives us an idea of where we want to be. And you'll see that we're going to start looking at numbers and telling if we're actually matching and how we're going to troubleshoot this press sheet. First quick example that I want to give you an idea of how I would go and look at a press sheet and see if it's correct. We're going to take a press sheet that I have here, and it was targeted to GRACOL. It's a real press sheet from a job that I did last week. And I want to get an idea of how I look at this press sheet to see if it's in G7 compliance. First thing that I'm going to check is I pretty much always check that first. You can almost always tell if a G7 print is going to be correct just by reading that one patch, the 50-40-40. As I fine-tune check, I look at the highlight patch, the 25-19-19, and the shadow, because I want to be neutral all the way up and down on it. But in general, for printing, if I read that 50-40-40, if that's not neutral, then I know I'm in trouble. So as we look at this first patch, we can tell a few things here. In SpectroDens that you see here, automatically calculates against the paper color. That means it's going to compensate for the paper color and change the value that our target is automatically. You'll notice it shows me visual things and tells me many things, and I'm going to show you a close-up of the screen. So looking at here, I'll also tell you how you'd see it on a different device if it didn't have a screen like this, because while the SpectroDens makes it easier, the theory is still pretty much the same no matter what device we're on. Now look here, I'm going to look over to the left-hand side, and you see a little word that says HR, and that's how my NPDC curve is. And this is showing me that I'm very close, but I'm a little bit too light. So it's -3. That means I need a little bit of density, so it says HR -3. That's effectively the L value. So that's showing me what my L value is, and then my tone curve. So HR is a little bit light. And that you can see my gray balance. That's the A and the B. The A is the green to red, and the B is the blue to yellow. If I look at that, that should be 0, 0, and the A being +1.2 means that I'm a little bit too red. The B being +3 means I'm a little bit, well, more than a little bit too yellow. I'm pretty yellow. And then if I look at it, I can look above it, and I can see what the SpectroDens recommends. So the SpectroDens recommends that I add 4 points of cyan, 2 points of magenta, where it is. That's bring my weight up, and that should, by more cyan, that should get rid of my little bit of pinkness that I'm seeing there. And it also should take care of the yellow cast that we're seeing here. Now you could all in your head, if you had a different instrument, you'd read this, and it would say that you're something like 59 or 60, 1, 3, and then in your head you'd have to actually calculate and say, I'm too red, I'm too, and translate that to the press. For the SpectroDens, it gives you the numbers right here. The main idea, look at the color numbers. These lab numbers are telling us that we're a little bit too pink and we're too yellow. SpectroDens gives us a little recommendation on how to get there. So this is called gray guide mode, and gray guide mode, and gray guide mode is going to give us some other things that we can look at as well. The next I look at is I click on the black 50 patch. That's my NPDC for the black. Now that same thing, I'm a little bit too light, so I'm going to add a couple of points there. So we're going to add a little bit there and make sure that we get that back where it needs. In this mode I'm using called Gray Guide, it shows me many things. If I click on a gray, it shows me gray balance. If I click on a solid, it's going to show me where that solid is. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on my cyan solid and see where my cyan ink is. And what you see at the top is it says cyan. It shows me the density so the pressman can see where he is. And right below that, delta E 2.3. That's compared to the reference values for GRACOL, or for ISO you see at the bottom, which are the main reference values. And I can see that cyan is correct. My cyan ink is where it should be. I have a check mark. I don't have to worry. The ink hasn't changed. Right where it should be in here. And the lab values are on the bottom if you wanted to reference it. Set my magenta. So I look at it. I've got a density of 148. Delta E is 3.18. I'm under my 5 delta E, so I'm in good shape here, and I have a check mark. So look at uneventful at this point. Next, now yellow, and yellow is showing me 1.6, and it's good delta E of 5.6. So that's not good. That's failing, and that's the problem. And it relates to what we saw in the gray balance, because the gray balance said we were too yellow as well. So I look at fails, and if I want to do a lot more research, I'm going to switch my SpectroDens to a mode called ISO check. So now I'm in ISO check mode. And when you look at ISO check mode, I click around on a few of the pieces of the sheet. And by click around, I can see that my patches are actually more around 7 or 8 delta E away. That's pretty far away. So I click on a patch, I read it, and you can see in here, not only does it tell me the delta E, but it gives me a recommendation of where to put it. So if I click on that, I look at yellow, you see a little minus that's highlighted, and it says minus 10.3. That means if I drop this ink 13 points, it predicts that I'll get to a delta E of 2.1. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to actually drop that down 13 points on press, and I should be able to pull that down to where that yellow is passing. Now, if I didn't have a SpectroDens, if I had a traditional spectrometry, I'd read the log number, I'd look at the reference chart, and then I'd calculate in my head you need to reduce yellow. Not so you've done it a bunch of times, but it helps to have a device that does it for you. Especially if you have many people using it. It's not everybody does math and thinks the same way. So then I do after I've checked these. So I've seen my yellow is out. I want to glance at my overprints and see what's going on there. Now you can see on the bottom, these are the target LAB numbers. See in the SpectroDens window, in addition to a delta E, it's showing me the value that I have there. And if you look here, you can see the CY overprint has a star of 30. If I look at my target for that CY overprint, it's 25 is the star. That's just telling me too yellow. So by looking at that, I can check. I can see that overprint is too yellow. When I bring down my yellow, that's probably going to bring my overprints where it will pass. So important to see. The second thing I'm going to check is the other overprints. I go to the Y. I can see Y is passing, but I want to make sure if I reduce my yellow that I'm not going to mess up my MY overprint. So I look, and that 49 is a little bit high. I have a little bit of room to move the yellow down there, and so I'm not going to hurt overprint too much by moving it down, moving yellow down. And then I look again, there's no yellow involved here. This is a good overprint. And when I print, if I move, it's not going to affect this at all. So quickly saying what I need here. Okay, so there's a few things that happen here. But based on this quick read of this press sheet, what I see here is that based on these measurements, I need to pull down the yellow to get gray balance and to improve and pull down the yellow. In addition to getting gray, I'm going to pull my yellow into an ISO pass. I'm going to actually, more importantly, fix my overprints so that my mix is correct. So quick, you can see with that couple of reads there, we can see what's wrong with this press sheet and what's going on with it. What I normally would do when I achieve a G7 calibration is I actually dot gain against my reference benchmark. And I can run that in here too as well. But I could see, if I had done that, I would see that my dot gain for yellow is a little higher than normal. And often these traditional metrics like dot gain and density confirm what we see when checking the G7 metrics. So compared to the benchmark value for that press, it's important to notice that we can see what happened. Now there's two situations too that where it becomes valuable. And if I went back to a trap that wasn't matching. So if my O was saying it was 7 delta E out, and I was a fairly low density, I could look at the lab values there and detect that maybe I'm contaminated. I'm picking up cyan or another color, and I'd be able to see that. So quickly on that check, if I was failing a solid, maybe it's not my density is too high. Maybe it's because something's wrong with the ink. So I can pick that up and see changes in the ink when I'm measuring for that. It's very important. And then these color aims will help you make up for things like your change in paper color, because it's the final values you're looking at. If you're on a yellower or bluer paper, you're going to have to move your density up or down to actually make that color be right. So it's going to help you and guide you with that a little bit. On here I have the SpectroDens in the famous arm attach mode. So I was joking with my customers a few times that I use this thing so much, and it's quick and easy. It's good for teaching people. It gives you quick results, as you saw there. I feel like if I don't have it on my arm attached to me, when I go in, that I'm naked. And I do it a lot of times. People say we just want to use our equipment, but I can do things a lot faster when I have this. So, example of last week I was on a web press run. Once you turn it on, it's like a jet engine flying through there. And SpectroDens, I was able to nail all the overprints and get quick information to the press operator that if we had to sit there and scribble on a pad of paper and look back and forth at a reference chart, would have been a lot slower. So pretty good. So I do feel like without it, I am disadvantaged in the press room. It's a pretty big part of my toolkit. Before, I want to talk a little bit about automation, and that is, as you saw me doing right there, that was clicking by hand, measuring a press sheet. And it's very important, if possible, to automate things. And that every single press sheet that gets pulled, scanned, so of automation means on the screen, instead of click, 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 and there's a problem like I was doing there, you're seeing it live. As you're running through the job, you're scanning the sheets, you're getting instant feedback on what's going on. You're seeing pass fails on the traps, the solids, you're comparing to dot gain, you're seeing everything. So in the world of modern printing, automation is essential. Better after the recession, because many people picked up presses from companies that went out of business, and there's a lot of good used equipment that had scanners. It's pretty infrequent these days that I go to somebody who doesn't have a scanner. But if you don't scanner, it's critical. So automation, ink presetting, and then trending, which I'll talk about in a minute. As I mentioned before, that's Peter Drucker up in the corner, the famous efficient consultant. And what he said, what gets measured gets managed. Keep that in mind. If you're not measuring it, you're not going to know where you are, and you're not going to know what type of condition you're in. A quick shot here of the Teshcon devices that they have. SpectroJet is a very inexpensive detachable one that you push across the sheet, and it reads the color bar in just a few seconds. It can be detached for packaging applications where you can read spot colors. And then below that, the SpectroDrive, which is fast and fully automated, and that's their kind of big, top of the line scanner. Then we get to the question of how do you correct the print condition? Now, I mentioned that press is very mechanical, so presses are changing all the time. So to maintain a print condition, we really want to benchmark everything. As we do G7 calibration, we want to make sure that we notate everything: blankets, roller stripes, pressure, ink, and we want to have that all written down. And then if we notice that we can't match color, typical thing might be the cyan suddenly is printing at 25%. When we calibrated, it was printing at 16%. In this, we've noticed that was the cyan unit. We tell the pressman to check blankets, roller, pressure, packing, and look at the color measurements and see if there's some paper issues or something else going on here. If we can, by having the pressman find on the press, and presses are always moving and changing, so most of the time this is what fixes it. But if we can correct it that way and with some small solid ink density adjustments, we can fix it. If it's too large of an adjustment, though, then we're going to lose our wrap. So if we move our density up down too much, we're going to change our ink film thickness, our overprints, and the actual color of the ink. If we do that, we might have to get through a job, but if that happens on job after job, then that means that, our impurities aren't going to be good. We're not going to be matching proofs. So if it's nothing that can be mechanically fixed on the press, and this could be major maintenance, you actually change the physical condition of the press. For some people, it's environmental, which means during certain times of the year, they can't control it. But if that happens, then at that point, you do a curve correction. So you redo the G7 calibration. So very important. Most people, they calibrate once, and after they calibrate, they'll be good for a year or maybe less than a year, but they're usually good for quite a while. And then they're watching it and just moving the press back and keeping the press in that condition, using it as kind of a dashboard for the press. So pretty important. The second thing is we want to make sure that we're watching. We want to make sure that we see when the press moves out of calibration. We don't want to have a customer coming in and be unable to match their proof. Another thing is that when you rate, you may get so that you're hitting your make ready in 20 minutes, half an hour. The press moves out, that may go to 40 minutes, then it may go to 50 minutes, then it may go to an hour. It's going to keep moving away until it gets so bad that you finally realize that there's a problem. But then between really you have a problem and when you have the great make ready, in that time, the assessment is not going to tell you. He's going to keep matching color, and incrementally it's going to get worse and worse. So you're going to start out good, eventually it gets worse. What we're doing is watching those measurements, and as they move out, we then want to be correcting it and adjusting it. So instead of waiting for it just to get worse and worse over time, that time it gets worse and we notice that day after day, we want to correct that either on the press or through the curve. So the bases that I work with, they're always watching and measuring. They compare to the benchmark. If that press has got a trend where it's gone in the wrong direction, then we're going to correct it. We're going to fix that. So the thing we have here is a case study with HardingPoorman. HardingPoorman is a $28 million printer with 5 locations. They've been a G7 master printer since 2009. 2 G7 professionals on staff, of which Jim is one of them. And they consistently achieve less than 2 delta E color variants in their press runs. Very successful, very precise. If I had to list somebody who does it the way it should be done, these guys are a perfect example. She talks about TeshCon and how he first saw it. And as you saw in the way we looked at before, the main thing is the instruments take all the math out of it, easy to use, and every press minute actually has a SpectroDens. So they've got a bunch of them there, one for each press. What we're going to do now is talk to Jim. We're going to ask him a couple questions, and in a second I'll get him on mute to talk.
Jim, a little bit about your role at Harding Group. HPG HardingPoorman Group is in Indianapolis, Indiana. We're a group of interconnected companies all under one roof. We do commercial offset, like format, variable data, and digital printing. Prepress systems manager. I have a long history in prepress production, and also the color manager for HardingPoorman Group and all of its divisions. So I oversee the prepress hardware, software, file servers, networking, an archival, and administer our Printnergy front end. Yeah. I've been a G7 professional for several years, and actually followed Don Hutchins for quite a while prior to G7 becoming a specification, and have a pretty extensive history in it. Jim, can you, when you use G7 for performing a make ready, how do you perform your make readies, and how do you use G7? First of all, we use G7 to calibrate our presses. We're 100% 20 micron stochastic, and we are all UV. So our make-readies are critical. Our average run length is between 2,000 and 5,000. So we prep make-readies all day. That's what we do. So the initial calibration of the presses and documenting densities and target densities, we have 3 to 4 plate curves for each press, and the substrate that we print determines in our MIS system which plate curve will be used. So we have known targets for each different bucket of substrates, if you will, and those are in our press, and we send 3 ink presets to our presses from Kernity. So we allow the press console to read the color bar and bring us to target densities. We use a test con to measure gray balance, predominantly in the quarter and midtones, and to make adjustments for any tasks.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. What about troubleshooting? How do you troubleshoot a job if you can't achieve the make ready in a timely manner?
We go to make ready. First of all, we don't speed it up for very long. Our process is 15 minutes on a make ready, and if we don't have an acceptable match to prove, the pressman will stop the press and come and get me or our press group manager. We take our devices and we start troubleshooting the sheet. We use ISO check to check that the LA values of our primaries are what we expect them to be, and if not, how high it may be. So it will also tell us what's the best we can expect to get given the substrate we're on. As a UV printer, we print on a lot of exotic substrates and plastics and substrate cleansy, so to measure the substrate relative to the GRACOL target is critical for us. We use color circle often to measure the reference, the G7 proof to the press sheet, and that gives us an ability to have an empirical go-no-go for the pressman, so that he knows to run this job or not to run this job. And we measure dot gain, and we're not so concerned what it is, just that it's within between the 4 colors, that we don't have something out of control on the press.
Yeah. Now, I know the other day, Jim, that you mentioned that your press understand how to troubleshoot pretty much the same metrics. They understand lab, they understand how to troubleshoot everything using everything we're looking at there before, and they all have a SpectroDens too.
The freshmen, one thing is they all understand the LED color. They know when they're too light, too dark. They know when to add, when to take away. They know when to do both. Another thing specific to the TashCon instrument, they use it. If I borrow a TashCon from a press console, they want to know how will I have it, when will they get it back. So it's a device, an instrument that they use in every job that they print. So they do understand gray balance. They do use many of the metrics in G7, but use the devices on every job.
Yeah. And a question that people always are interested in is, how often do you have to change your plate curves, or how often do you hold the print condition?
We rarely make a global change to our plate curves. We only on occasion, I've not made a job-specific plate move in probably 4 months. Again, 3 to 4 plate curves for each press based on substrates, and we generally will make a global change in our plate curves.
Okay. Now, how often do you, or how do you compensate for different papers?
the paper difference is done when we do our G7 calibration, and we do various stocks and analyze and put them into buckets. So we have curves for coated, uncoated, matte, and then a certain bucket of plastics that we use. Using takes the substrate into account, and that really is what made this such a valuable instrument to me in the beginning. And then got the buy-in for my freshmen.
Yeah. And then just before we have any other final thoughts or words for the people who are listening?
It's successful, and I think the reason that part of the reason that it's so successful and that we can do it is process control.
Yeah.
We measure everything. We measure our plates. We measure our chemistry. We watch the press chemistry. We measure everything we can measure. And if you measure something, it gets better. And we measure everything we can, and we try to maintain our equipment in a known state. And we know what our stake in the ground is. So when we're not hitting it, we have a lot of known values to verify.
Okay.
So thank you very much for sharing all that. That's it's real information. It's great to hear what people are doing in a plant as compared to a consultant who, like myself, who is teaching but not always using things in a practical situation, and appreciated it. So, looking at the end of this, we have a Q&A session. But if you're watching this on the internet instead of live, you can have Q&A, and you can actually ask us questions. Just email questions to Allison Lacacha, and you can see your email address there up on the screen. And we appreciate your listening to this and tuning in, and hopefully answered questions. Send an email. And if you're interested also in a trial unit or demo unit, send an email to Allison as well. Anyway, thanks for your time, and we appreciate you watching this presentation.